Hi, welcome to Decoding Confidence. I'm your host, Advita Patel, a confidence and influence coach. And over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be digging into what confidence actually looks like in the workplace. Not the fake it till you make it stuff, but the real deal. So whether you're navigating tricky stakeholder conversations, trying to get your voice heard in the boardroom, or you're just trying to figure out how to back yourself when the imposter syndrome kicks in, this is your space. I'll be talking to people who've been there, sharing practical tools you can actually use, and unpacking the myths that keep us second guessing ourselves. So go and grab your drink and let's decode this confidence thing together. Enjoy this episode. In today's episode, I am going to be talking about vulnerability. And I'm going to be upfront with you right from the start of this episode, because vulnerability is definitely a word that has been misunderstood and misrepresented, I would say. Rather than misunderstood, actually, misrepresented. Because when people hear the word be more vulnerable, they sometimes think it means about spilling your entire life story in a team meeting, or worse, that they may think it means being very personal about questions that they may be asking their team or dumping their emotional baggage on people. And that's not what vulnerability is about, actually. That's not even close. Vulnerability is definitely more about humanness. It's not about how much you're disclosing in team meetings or to others. And as a confident leader, most confident leaders I know generally know the distinction between genuine vulnerability and performative vulnerability. But if you've ever thought, I'm being told to be more open, but it feels a bit unsafe, or I don't want to overshare, but I do want to be genuine, or maybe something about how vulnerability is being encouraged at work, but it doesn't sit right with you at the moment because it doesn't feel safe enough, then this episode is for you, because I'm going to unpack in the next 15, 20 minutes what I mean by confident vulnerability and what it is and what it isn't. So what is vulnerability? One of the things about vulnerability, and the reason it's misrepresented, is because we do confuse it with being open. But vulnerability isn't about how much you're sharing. It's about how intentional you are with what you share and when you share. So I often come back to my future best friend, Brené Brown's work. Brené Brown is a sociologist in this space, and I would say one of the pioneers in vulnerability. She describes vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. But what really matters is why that exposure is happening and what's the point of it? Like, what's the point of being vulnerable? When vulnerability is done well, and when it's confident vulnerability, it builds trust. It helps create psychological safety, and it helps invite honesty without putting pressure on people to be something that they are not. But when it's done badly, it can shut people down, or it can put them on the spot, and it can make people feel very uncomfortable. And in fact, it can break trust quite badly, quite badly. Because I do see it happening all the time. You know, I've seen leaders go, right, they've been on a course or they've been told through a coaching session or something that they need to be more vulnerable. So then they'll go to a team meeting and start sharing something deeply personal about themselves without any context whatsoever. And it could be that they're going through something at home and they think, right, I could share this because at least I'm being a bit real. But what can happen in those situations is that they've basically shifted all the emotional labor that's on their shoulders to their team. So now their team are going, well, what the heck is happening here? Like, you end up managing your manager's feelings and their kind of emotional exposure stuff rather than thinking about your job. And the context is all gone. That isn't vulnerability, by the way. That's abdication from the job that you're being hired to do. And that's the difference. People can sense it when leaders are being performative with vulnerability and when they're being genuine, when they're genuinely building connection. You would have sensed it yourself. You know when someone is oversharing, they may be potentially being manipulative, or they are just talking through things without any context whatsoever. And it does make people feel a bit uncertain about that relationship. And it will make you question, well, why are they sharing that with me? And the thing is about vulnerability is that most people, and you would have been here in this situation, is that you can see through when someone's being performative with vulnerability, when they may be being a bit manipulative with what they are sharing, or they're trying to take away their accountability of something that's gone wrong. So they're being overly vulnerable with what's happened because they want to abdicate their responsibility. We've all been there. We've all seen it. I do want us to be a bit careful here, though, because I do have many conversations with people, especially leaders, who are working with individuals who they deem as too vulnerable. And what I mean by that, and what they mean by that, is often when leaders are giving feedback to somebody that is a bit tough to hear, let's just say, or difficult conversation to have, the individual may demonstrate some emotions, which is fair, and that it's absolutely okay to feel emotions and demonstrate emotions. And it can feel like hurt when somebody's giving you feedback that you don't agree with, and it's really difficult to process that emotion in that moment, especially when you're taken by surprise, for example. But what happens on the other side is that leaders that I often coach will say to me that I try to tell someone that something hasn't happened. I try to be vulnerable from my perspective to demonstrate actually them doing something wrong has now impacted how I'm presenting myself around that boardroom table. And then that person starts sharing all the challenges that's going on with me. And then I feel really unsafe to talk about what the challenges are, because I don't want them to feel that I am being bullish or being unnecessarily unkind. And that's a tough one. That is a tough one to manage. But ultimately, in the workplace, we are all there to do a good job and to be our best self. And if somebody is feeling the emotions due to the feedback that you shared with them and they're being vulnerable towards you, then take it as given, is what I would say, and allow them to express how they are feeling, because that's really important. And we have to take that as given when somebody is downloading some of the challenges that they're facing. But then we need to fix it, and we need to have a bit of a plan in place to understand how we can help. Because downloading a load of stuff that's going on and there's no solution, you're just kind of helping them not really solve that problem, and you're not supporting them in the way you should be, which may end up knocking their self-esteem and confidence. And it may stop you then giving them examples or helping them get better at their job. So I want us to be careful about not mistaking being intentional with vulnerability and looking at context to not allowing people to share vulnerably. And like I said, this isn't an easy topic at all. It isn't an easy topic, and none of the habits are that I've shared, but you need to understand what vulnerability is and isn't, and when it's being used to manipulate and when it's being used in a genuine way. Because the thing is, people can tell the difference by how you're acting. They can tell when you're genuinely feeling vulnerable and when you are just sharing because you want to manipulate the situation potentially. I want to share a bit of a story here that stayed with me for a while, and it's about a leader that I worked with. Must have been about 8, 9, 10 years ago now. This leader was really private, like incredibly private. They never talked about their personal life ever. They kept everything quite transactional. They were quite direct with how they spoke, which is fine, right? On its own, it's absolutely fine. It's no problem. People are private, and no one should ever be put in a position to share something that they don't want to share. But this is when things got a little bit complicated, because in team meetings, this same leader would expect their team to expose themselves. So they used to ask quite personal questions about people's personal lives because they'd been coached, I think, or they'd read a book about being more vulnerable, but they were only doing it from a one-way perspective. And there was this kind of expectation of openness with the team, but they didn't role model it, and there was no sense of safety or psychological safety in this team at all. This leader just kept going, tell me more about what's going on in your personal life, share more about what's happening with you, because I want to get to know you a bit better. But they didn't open up to them. So trust between each other was completely dysfunctional, and the power dynamic was real. But that's the key point here. Like, forcing vulnerability is not vulnerability. It's actually control. So when a leader is asking emotional, open questions without a kind of offering anything back themselves, trust gets eroded very quickly, because people start going, well, why are they asking me that? Like, what's the end game here? Are they just wanting to find out something about myself so they can use it against me in my performance review? Are they asking me this because we're going through a redundancy program? People don't feel safe when you're kind of one way asking these kind of personal questions, but you're not giving anything back in return at all. And that's when confidence takes a big hit. Because now what's happening is people are second guessing everything. They'll be second guessing, thinking, what's safe to say here? What's going to be held against me? What's happening here? There's no context whatsoever. And that isn't psychological safety. And that's why that kind of behavior can undermine confidence very quickly, and trust in the team has completely gone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about research here, because I think it's really important that we bring in some theory in what I'm saying. So Amy Edmondson, the author of Fearless Organization, she works on psychological safety, and she shows that in a psychological safe space, people speak up more, they share ideas, they take risks, and they feel safe from embarrassment or punishment. So safety doesn't just come from questions, it comes from behavior. So that leader I just spoke to you about, they were just asking lots of questions. So when people feel pressured to disclose a load of stuff through questions, they do become guarded and they stop bringing kind of their full thinking to the table. And Amy's work demonstrates that. She demonstrates that if you don't have that psychological safe space where people can be vulnerable without consequences, it is going to impact how they show up for themselves. Because when people start asking what's safe here for me to say, rather than what's useful for me to contribute here, there's a shift. It's subtle, but there is a shift, and it can be very damaging to the team dynamics. And it's when energy is also impacted. I'm going to talk about energy in the next episode, but when you're kind of not being able to be your best self because you're trying to figure out what on earth is going on with all these personal questions, over time, it'll wear you down. And over time, it'll make you much smaller and make you much quieter because you're getting guarded and you're getting defensive. And that is completely opposite of what good leadership should do. And it's a complete opposite of vulnerability, because vulnerability isn't about expecting lots of people to share lots of personal things. It's about asking people to show up as the authentic self in a safe space. So let's talk about what confident vulnerability does look like in practice. So confident leaders don't demand vulnerability, they model it. They model it through their behaviors. It may look like acknowledging uncertainty during change, naming something that's quite difficult or challenging, or admitting a mistake, or explaining what they've learned during a failure or a moment that didn't go in the way they wanted it to go. It's not a big thing, and it's not about emotional dumping. It's about keeping things a bit real. And this is where Brené's research is actually very helpful. So in her book, Daring Greatly, a fantastic read, she says that vulnerability, as I said at the start of this episode, is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. But she's very clear that vulnerability without boundaries isn't courage, it is about exposure. And Brené found that vulnerability is actually our most accurate measure of courage. So when we're willing to show up and be seen, even when we can't control the outcome, so this is where confidence, remember, trust within ourselves, that's when real connection can happen. But, and I said it at the start of this episode, it has to be intentional. That is critical. Confident leaders process that first, and then they share intentionally. And in my book, I talk about a model called OPEN, the OPEN model for professional vulnerability. And it's something that you can implement quite quickly and hopefully remember as a bit of an acronym. I go deeper into this in my book, but I want to give you a brief overview about what it's about here. So O is about owning your style, and it's about understanding what responsibilities that you have and finding the answers in collaborative ways, and demonstrating vulnerability through things like asking questions like, I haven't experienced this before, but I want to find out together on how we're going to do this. That's demonstrating your kind of openness on that. P is about purpose-driven sharing. So it's about sharing something that helps others learn and make better decisions. So when you're sharing a mistake, try to finish by sharing something that you've learned so other people can learn from you as well. E is about extending that psychological safety. So about creating that space where humans can respond with curiosity, not judgment. So if someone is admitting a mistake, ask them, what can we learn from this, before you kind of go straight into solution mode, because that really helps people understand that it's safe for me to make mistakes here. Then N is about navigating cultural context. So understanding what vulnerability looks like in different cultural contexts is really important. And this is where we have to adjust where necessary, because what feels quite normal in one place may not work in another. These aren't big, scary moments, by the way. They're quite small, intentional things on how you show up and how you help other people show up. And I think that's what is important about vulnerability. Now, talking about cultural context and understanding privilege and power, this bit is going to get a bit deep. And the reason it's going to get deep because I want to talk about if you're a leader from a marginalized or underrepresented background, what vulnerability could look like for you. Because in all honesty, vulnerability doesn't kind of land in a vacuum. For some people, being open at work has historically come with a much greater risk. A much greater risk of being judged, being stereotyped, and probably being seen as less capable as well. People from marginalized backgrounds or those in their early careers, being vulnerable and being more open can carry more of a risk, and the stakes are definitely much higher for them. So when I talk about confident vulnerability, I also have to share with you that it's about choice. It's not about sharing absolutely everything. You don't owe anyone your story, and you don't have to disclose your personal struggles to be seen as genuine. No one should ever be forced to be open in the name of inclusion, because true inclusion means recognizing that vulnerability does look different depending on your culture, your gender, your seniority, your lived experience, and all sorts of other challenges and issues as well. For some leaders, showing emotion is actually seen as quite powerful and quite strong, but for others, it can be weaponized against them. And for some, admitting uncertainty can be quite refreshing, but again, for some people, it's a confirmation of bias and stereotypes. So confident vulnerability is about deciding what feels safe for you and what serves you in that moment. And also, as I said earlier, about protecting and this is where power comes into play and privilege. And if you are somebody who has privilege in the workplace, and what I mean by privilege is decision-making capability, you've got seniority, people listen, you've got influence, you can demonstrate impact. A part of your job is to create conditions where you're building that psychological safe space where people can be vulnerable without it being used against them. It's holding people accountable around you. So if you see someone using someone's vulnerability in a negative way, that's the work I would expect someone in a decision-making capacity to stand up against and speak up against as well. Okay, right. So I want us to get a bit practical now, because I always like to bring this back into what you can do in the moment and the habits you can put in place, because confidence and confident vulnerability is built on small moments, not big dramatic gestures. You can't just go in the next day and download absolutely everything and expect people to kind of trust you. As I said before, it can actually make people retreat away from you. So first thing to do is start narrating your thinking out loud a bit more. So instead of pretending that you have all the answers, just say things like, right, this is how I'm approaching this decision, or this is how this is still evolving, and here's my thinking worked out. That builds trust without having to overshare significant amounts of information. You're being transparent about the process, and you're not having to expose your entire world, inner workings to everybody. The second is about acknowledging emotion without having to outsource it to other people. There's a huge difference between saying, this is a tough moment, and then asking people to manage those feelings around that. Try saying in that moment, here's what I've learned since we last spoke, or say, I've got this wrong before, and here's what I'm doing differently. That helps you kind of signal growth. So that growth mindset work, Carol Dweck's work that I spoke about in previous episodes, that isn't anything to do with weakness, it's evolution. And then the third thing is about inviting perspective into the discussions that are taking place. So rather than pretending you've got all the answers, you can ask things like, what am I missing? Or what do you think? Instead of kind of like, tell me everything about what's going on in your personal life. That sort of shifting questions can change everything. You're not asking for a confession. You're not asking for reassurance. You're not even asking for permission. You're asking for input. You're showing people that actually I'm not perfect and I could do with your help. These aren't big, scary, soul-bearing moments, right? These are just genuine things that hopefully will help you build vulnerable cultures over time. Because when you build these cultures, confidence will just thrive. because it demonstrates that you're secure enough in yourself to learn, and you're secure enough in your team to help them learn. I'm fully aware that none of this sounds like rocket science. Of course, when you feel safe and you feel you're able to be who you need to be to do your best work, you're going to be a higher performer. You're going to want to give more to the organization that you're supporting. But yet in organizations, this still goes wrong. People still can't be their best selves because of poor practices around them and poor behaviors. And often it is down to the fact that there isn't enough vulnerability being shown intentionally, and people are fearing speaking up. Okay, I want to leave with a few questions to sit with you. So I want you to kind of think about vulnerability and what it means for you. How do you model humanity without asking others to take risks that you're not going to take or you're not willing to take yourself? Where might you be protecting your ego instead of protecting the trust that you're trying to build? What would you change if you allowed yourself to say, I don't know, more often? Like, how would you change that? And what privilege and power do you hold? And most importantly, what does confident vulnerability look like for you? Not anyone else, not your boss, not your manager, not your next door neighbor, not your colleague, but for you. Are you creating space for honesty, or is it an environment where there's a pressure to perform fake openness? I'm just curious, right? There's no judgment here from me. I just want you to kind of think a bit deeper about what confident vulnerability means for you. Finally, before I let you crack on with your day, remember, vulnerability isn't about telling people absolutely everything about your entire life. It's about being grounded enough and being intentional enough to be human. Confident leaders create safety, and it's a confidence to be human without making it someone else's problem. And it's a courage to be honest without losing your authority. That's what's important in this. And trust is the foundation of all of this work. And it is about consistency when you do this. And like I said, when people feel safe, confidence follows naturally. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about energy. And this links in very nicely with this episode about vulnerability, because when vulnerability goes wrong, as I said earlier, your energy pays the price. If you want to start building this type of confidence gently, and you want to kind of tiptoe into it, I've got a 30-day confidence challenge where you will feel at least 1% more confident every day. You can download it for free. It's in the show notes, the link. So please do download that if you haven't done so already. Also, if you found this episode interesting and you think it's going to help someone else, then please do forward it on to them. It makes such a difference in how much exposure this podcast can have when you share it and when you recommend it. That means so much more than anything for me, to be honest. If more people can see that there's help out there for them if they want it, that is a dream come true for me. So please do forward this on to somebody that you think will find it helpful. And if you found this episode useful, I would love you to leave me a short review on wherever you listen to this podcast episode on, whether that's Apple, whether that's Spotify, whether that's Audible, whether that's YouTube. If you can't find a review section, then please feel free to DM me. You can find me on all the socials, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, under Decoding Confidence, or you can find me by my name, Advita Patel. Thank you once again for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode and to listen to me. I am excited to come back to you next week with a brand new episode. But if you haven't heard the previous episodes, please go back. I do explore the other habits in more detail. And remember, if there's anything you want me to talk about or you want me to share in the future, let me know. And finally, before I go, if you want to be a guest on this podcast or you've got a recommendation for a guest for this podcast, please drop me an email to advita@decodingconfidence.com. I'll see you next time.